The only thing more important than Halloween is Titus's birthday. At some point, someone would have to recognize that everyone is compelled by some kind of supernatural law by which to address themselves under the magnanimous spell that is his existence, qualifying the superiority of his inherent birthright as the King of Halloween, or the Prince of Halloween, or the whatever have you that he chooses to earn, qualifying his investments into the maturity. At which point there are many seeking to make myself subject to these festive functions, as some kind of dressing up as the mystical mechanisms, such as the function of the Antichrist, Satan incarnate, the great noble king of the earth. It would be a tragic backstory, a systematic failure of specific intent, generating exponential investments and pressures, derelictions of duty, qualifying terrorism and ex post facto, in order to craft and mold and torture into the reforming of the socially engineered function, qualifying the exponential tragedies upon the earth they are forced to suffer by virtue of their own ignorance and greed, qualifying our active validation towards the tragic. The functions of their sorceries and mechanisms in order to engage in their rituals, in order to manifest their seances and its effects towards the perfection of those who would dress up on these Hallows Eves, qualifying their exponential investment into the harvest in preparation for the winter. And winter, as they say, is coming. At which point you have many diverse angles by which to observe these tragedies, qualifying the obligation in law for the limitation on holding persons, a limit of 24 hours, before it becomes a criminal act of human trafficking, at which point each 24 hours after the original point becomes a compounding error, and that compounding error is stacking human trafficking. And these liabilities, such as the ones described, and many of the others which are advantaged by it, only possible because of the restraints in question, qualify their seances in order to manufacture their predetermined conclusions towards their devotions to the deceitful, the dark, and the thievery. At which point the world and its various treaties become destabilized, as the absence of justice requires its restoration. To one censor, publish, and mass distribute the answer for the point of the enforcement of the original solution, by which gives the original powers from legal, correct, unfraudulent trades, at which point they're seeking to replace that and its rightful owners with themselves through the mechanisms of their human trafficking, overpowering the broker nation and its king to be subject to the spirit of Satan, forming their Antichrist, forming their international torment for the entirety of humanity. The feast and gluttony upon their evil qualifies their drunken raves, and these unsatisfiable evils qualifying the permanent compounding errors creates exponential liability and the obligation to to acknowledge the obligation to cling fast to law and order, lest the spell and seances succeed in their tragic outcomes. Without the original order and the original balances, you had the manufacture of the Confederacies, threats against the Russians, qualifying its proxy war, causing the deaths in Ukraine from their special operations, which is but a taste of the tragedy of David's absence, qualifying their exponential pursuit towards international horrors, which will only grow worse as order begins to degrade at higher and higher rates, qualifying their systematic self-suicide as their devotion to anti-humanism manifests upon their errors and their tragedies from their inferiorities and their jealousies, qualifying their gluttony upon the blood of the innocent, upon the blood of the holy, and as they've drinking the wine of their hatred for all who follow God, they would have manufactured the compounding errors of not having order under competence. Had a bit of a energy crisis there, but if they can engage in the evolution of the markets, we might be able to solve some of the ghosts inside the papers. At which point, the liabilities of the compounding ghosts in the papers, qualifying the errors and the tragedies, compounded by the treaties and the contracts being subverted, destabilizing the world, engaging in the haunting of the various economies and societies, qualifying our development and the research of the Confederate Steward, at which point the character for the Steward of the Confederacy wants to actively engage in the framing and the mechanisms of that, qualifies their engagements of threats of violence and the application of those threats of violence, such as the intelligence agency's use of child abuse throughout the obstructed contracts network, which would have been threatened without the obstruction, with different obstructions, such as their child abuse campaigns for the Confederate KKK slave raid terrorist skirmishes, which would have been subject to David as intelligence oversight, would have direct ability to obstruct KKK terrorist operations, at which point the child abuse skirmishes would have been neutralized by his lawful office, at which point the accusation that the person stopping the thing is guilty of the thing because he was able to form the network before the obstruction, as the argument for the obstruction is fraud, as to prove criminal intent by Stewart. And those who are aiding and abetting, such as their character for the QAnon, which is the function of the generation of the FBI's Confederate loyalties in its manufacture of its Nazi overthrow of the United States government, through the creation of fraudulent defenses, such as the creation of the hippies, which, as those who study history understand, were created by the FBI in order to defame and diminish and insult and disregard the function of the anti-war protesters, at which point the function of the QAnon is to be the discarded, ignored, and discarded versions of the hippie variation, qualifying them as a false defense, qualifying the additional exponential vulnerabilities of the child abuse by them being there in order to insult those who would stop it as outsiders or weird or a bit strange, at which point those who are in the know in the creation of the Confederate operations to create the manipulation for their wizard terrorism qualifies the security of the actual conspiracy, which is the defense of their black markets, such as their child abuse systems, at which point their defense of the child abuse systems targeted those they wanted to groom into positions, such as the position of the Antichrist. That's enough of that. Anyways, happy birthday, Titus, and happy Halloween to everyone else. At which point, your celebrations upon glee and terrors of the night might culminate in delicious treats of sultry deliciousness.